The warm afternoon sun cast gentle rays over the park, painting the grassy paths in shades of gold and green. Leo Williams sat quietly on his favorite bench, his worn cane resting by his side. He breathed in the comforting scent of freshly cut grass and listened to the soft rustling of leaves in the trees overhead. This small corner of the world had become Leo's refuge since retirement, a place where he could sit undisturbed, soaking in the peace and letting memories drift through his mind like old songs. In this park, Leo felt at home. It was here that he could escape from the noise, the judgments, and the world outside, where too often he'd been underestimated or disrespected. Here, in this quiet space, he was just a man with time to think. As he looked out over the playground where children laughed and played, he felt a gentle satisfaction. He'd spent his life working hard, giving to his community as a teacher and mentor. Now, he told himself, he had earned the right to simply sit and enjoy the sounds of life around him. The tranquility was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching. Light, quick, these were not the steps of someone out for a leisurely stroll. Leo didn't look up at first, choosing to remain in his serene world. But the footsteps stopped nearby, casting a long shadow over him, and a young voice broke through the silence. "Hey, old man," came the voice, sharp and mocking. Leo glanced up, meeting the gaze of a teenage boy with scruffy blonde hair and a smirk on his face. The boy's posture was cocky, his hands stuffed casually into his pockets as he rocked back on his heels. Leo had seen that look before, a certain arrogance, a belief that the world owed him something. Leo's calm expression didn't waver. "Afternoon," he replied simply, his voice carrying a hint of the quiet strength that had guided him through a lifetime of trials. The boy didn't walk away. Instead, he lingered, as though searching for some entertainment. "Guess you've got a lot of time on your hands, huh?" The boy continued, his tone laced with disdain. "Must be nice, just sitting around with nothing better to do." Leo held the boy's gaze steadily. There was no anger in his eyes, but neither was there any trace of submission. "I've earned my rest," Leo replied, his voice steady and dignified. "Spent years working hard, teaching, helping people find their way." The boy chuckled, rolling his eyes in mock amusement. "Yeah, sure. Worked real hard. Huh? What did you do? Clean up after people?" A flicker of tension crossed Leo's face as he gripped his cane a little tighter. Still, he didn't rise to the bait. "I was a teacher," he said, his voice calm. "Taught a lot of kids who needed it." The boy's smirk only widened, as if he found this response laughable. He gave a little shrug, clearly unimpressed. "Yeah, well, I guess some people just know how to take orders better than others." Leo took a deep breath, letting the insult roll off his shoulders. He had encountered this attitude before, a casual disrespect for people of his background, a belief that he belonged on the sidelines, forgotten and ignored. It wasn't the first time he'd been spoken down to, and it wouldn't be the last. But Leo was a man who knew his worth, and he wasn't about to let a teenager's words undermine his dignity. "Every man has something to teach," he said quietly, leaning back on the bench. "If others are willing to learn." The boy's expression faltered for a moment, perhaps confused by Leo's lack of reaction, by his calm resilience. The boy seemed to want to provoke him, to make him angry. When Leo didn't respond with frustration or anger, the boy scoffed softly and took a step back, shuffling his feet as though he was about to leave. But something in his gaze suggested he wasn't quite finished yet. "Don't let me stop you from whatever it is you're doing here," the boy taunted again, glancing at the bench as if it were something beneath him. I guess that's all there is to do when you've got nothing better going on. Leo looked up at him with a calm intensity, his expression unreadable. Enjoying the quiet, he replied simply. There was a firmness in his tone now, a subtle reminder that he was not a man to be dismissed. The boy lingered for another moment, as if searching for some sign of weakness. When he found none, he muttered something under his breath and turned to walk away, shuffling down the path with a last quick glance over his shoulder. As the boy's footsteps faded, Leo allowed himself a small sigh, his grip loosening on his cane. He had faced worse in his life, much worse, but he knew, deep down, that this encounter was not over. The look in the boy's eyes told him so, a flash of smugness that promised this was only the beginning. He straightened his posture, returning his gaze to the trees and focusing on his breathing. He could feel a subtle tension lingering in the air, the boy's words hanging like a dark cloud over his quiet refuge. But Leo was not a man easily moved. He had built his life on strength, on resilience, and on a belief that anger only fueled those who thrived on hate. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, grounding himself in his own sense of self-worth. He hoped the boy would lose interest and move on, leaving Leo to his peace. But he sensed, as he heard the faint echo of footsteps once more, that the boy had not left the park. No, he was circling back. That spark of smugness ignited into something sharper, more determined. Leo braced himself, feeling the weight of years of experience settle over him. He had been through storms before, and if this boy wanted to test him, Leo knew he would not break. With a deep breath, he prepared himself to face whatever was coming next, knowing that he would meet it, not with anger or hate, but with the quiet, steady strength that had carried him through a lifetime of battles. The next morning brought a crispness to the air, carrying a whisper of the changing seasons. Leo had spent years welcoming each fall, watching as the park transformed into a tapestry of amber and gold. The park's stillness was like an old friend, a place of peace and introspection. Leo's usual bench sat waiting for him, its worn wood gleaming faintly in the early sunlight. He took his seat, resting his cane beside him, and allowed himself to settle into the comfort of familiarity. But today, he couldn't quite shake the memory of yesterday's encounter. Just as Leo was beginning to let the morning's tranquility wash over him, he heard footsteps, quick, light, and unmistakably familiar. His heart sank slightly, but he kept his expression calm, choosing not to acknowledge the presence he felt approaching. The footsteps slowed as they neared him, and there was a pause, a silence that seemed to demand his attention. "Still here, old man?" The familiar voice cut through the silence, carrying that same mocking tone from the day before. Leo looked up, his eyes meeting the smirking gaze of the teenage boy. The boy stood a little closer this time, his posture more confident, almost aggressive. There was something new in his expression, a glint that hinted at an intention beyond mere words. The boy crouched, picking up a small pebble, and tossed it idly between his hands, his smirk widening as he watched Leo's reaction. "Not too fast on your feet, are you?" the boy taunted, flicking the pebble in Leo's direction. The small rock bounced off Leo's shoe with a soft, harmless tap, but the intention was clear. Leo's jaw tightened, but he kept his gaze steady, refusing to let the boy see how his words and actions grated against his patience. "You know," the boy continued, tossing another pebble in the air before catching it, "my dad says people like you don't know their place. Says you all think you're better than you are." Leo's grip on his cane tightened, but his voice remained calm, almost gentle. Your father sounds like a man with a lot of opinions. The boy's smirk deepened. As if he sensed a victory, he stepped closer, leaning in slightly. Yeah, he is. And he's right. People like you don't deserve what you got. Always playing the victim card. Leo's calm demeanor remained, but his voice took on a sharper edge. Be careful, son. You're stepping into things you don't understand. The boy only laughed, flicking another pebble that bounced off Leo's leg. This one was a bit harder, the sound sharper. The boy's smirk broadened as he saw Leo's lips tighten. Getting a little worked up. Are we? He taunted. Guess you're not so tough after all. Leo looked at the boy, his expression unreadable. He knew that giving in to anger would only feed the boy's arrogance. Give him the satisfaction he was clearly seeking. Leo had spent a lifetime holding his ground, teaching himself that strength was not in retaliation, but in restraint. Son, Leo said, his voice low and steady, you've got a lot to learn about respect. And one day, you're going to find out that disrespect has a way of coming back to you. The boy leaned back, crossing his arms and chuckling as if Leo's words were nothing more than a joke. Oh yeah? And who's going to teach me? Huh? You? Leo didn't respond. He held the boy's gaze, allowing the silence to grow heavy between them. The boy shifted, clearly uncomfortable with Leo's steady stare. He looked down, kicking the ground lightly, his confidence faltering for a moment. But his arrogance quickly returned, and he picked up another pebble, tossing it back and forth in his hands. You know, my dad says people like you don't belong here. He sneered, his voice carrying a bitterness that was far too old for someone so young. Says you should stick to your own kind, not come around where you're not wanted. Leo felt the weight of the boy's words. The years of prejudice and hatred passed down through generations, settling like a stone in his chest. But he kept his expression calm, refusing to let the boy's taunts burrow into his heart. Your father's words don't make you a man, Leo replied, his voice firm. Actions do. And right now, all I see is a scared kid trying to act tough. The boy's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Leo thought he saw a flicker of vulnerability, a flash of uncertainty that hinted at something deeper beneath the boy's bravado. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a sneer. Yeah? Well, at least I know who I am. Don't have to prove anything to anybody, especially not to you. Leo sighed softly, leaning back on the bench. One day, you'll realize that's not true. That everyone has something to prove, even if it's just to themselves. The boy scoffed, rolling his eyes as if Leo's words were nothing more than the ramblings of an old man. Whatever, he muttered, turning as if to leave. But then he paused, looking over his shoulder with a smirk. Maybe tomorrow I'll bring my friends. We can see how tough you really are. Leo watched as the boy walked away, his steps slow and deliberate, as though savoring his perceived victory. Leo's heart ached with a mixture of sadness and disappointment, a bitter understanding that this boy was not the first he had encountered with this kind of arrogance. Nor would he be the last. He let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the boy's words settle over him like a shroud. The world had changed in many ways, but some things remained stubbornly the same. Prejudice was still passed down like an heirloom, generation to generation, and Leo wondered how many more years would have to pass before it finally faded away. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the park. Leo rose from the bench, steadying himself with his cane, and began his slow walk home. He knew that this encounter would not be the last, and he suspected that tomorrow would bring new challenges. But he would face them, as he had faced every other hardship in his life, with dignity. strength, and an unyielding belief in his own worth. As he walked, he offered a quiet prayer, not just for himself, but for the boy as well, a hope that one day, perhaps, he would come to understand the damage of the words he so casually wielded. For now, Leo would prepare himself, standing firm in the face of ignorance, just as he always had, and whatever tomorrow brought, he would meet it head-on, knowing that he would not be shaken. The following afternoon, Leo returned to the park. It had become a habit for him over the years, this daily ritual of finding solace among the trees and familiar sights. There was a quiet strength in the park, a kind of resilience he understood well, and today he would need that strength. He took his seat on the weathered bench, Kane resting at his side, and let his gaze settle on the distant trees and the patches of sunlight that dappled the ground. The faint laughter of children playing and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze filled the air, a comforting backdrop. He let his breathing slow, finding calm in the quiet rhythm of nature. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, he remained alert, sensing that the peace of the day would not last. And then, he heard them, the sounds of footsteps approaching. More than one pair. A group of teenagers emerged from around the bend, their voices loud and filled with laughter that was just a bit too sharp. Leo recognized the boy from the day before, standing at the front of the group with a smirk plastered across his face. But today, he wasn't alone. Two other boys flanked him, and they all wore matching expressions of defiance and smug amusement. "There he is," the boy said, nodding toward Leo. His voice carried an exaggerated bravado, as if he were putting on a performance for his friends. "See? I told you he'd be here, just like always." Leo held his ground, looking calmly at the boys as they approached, his gaze steady and unflinching. He could see the way the boy squared his shoulders, the way he puffed out his chest in an attempt to look tough. It was a familiar performance, one he had seen many times before in those who had mistaken arrogance for strength. "Afternoon," Leo said, his voice calm but firm. The lead boy scoffed, glancing at his friends with a grin. "Look at this," he said, nudging one of them with his elbow. "The old man thinks he's tough, just sitting here like he owns the place." The other boys laughed, one of them picking up a stick and twirling it idly in his hand, as if looking for something to do with it. Leo could sense the tension in the air, the way it thickened with each passing second. These boys had come here looking for trouble, and they weren't going to leave until they'd found it. "What brings you boys back here?" Leo asked, his tone neutral, though his gaze was sharp. The lead boy took a step closer, crossing his arms. "Maybe I just wanted to see if you'd show up again. Wanted to see if you're really as tough as you think you are." Leo met his gaze without flinching. "There's nothing tough about sitting in a park, son. But I'd say it takes strength to walk away from trouble." The boy laughed, loud and mocking, and his friends joined in, emboldened by their leader's confidence. "Oh, so now you're going to tell us how to live our lives? Listen to this guy," he sneered, turning to his friends. "He thinks he's our dad or something." The other boys smirked, clearly enjoying the show, their eyes flicking back and forth between Leo and their ringleader. Leo watched them carefully, his expression calm, though inside he felt a quiet anger stirring. He had faced countless taunts and insults in his life, each one leaving its mark. But he had always prided himself on his ability to stay steady, to rise above the pettiness of others. Today, he would do the same. "Respect isn't something you get by pushing people around," Leo said, his voice steady and even. "It's something you earn." The boy rolled his eyes, his smirk growing wider. "Earn? What's that supposed to mean? You think I care what you think? He picked up a small stone from the ground and tossed it in Leo's direction, though it landed harmlessly at his feet. You're nothing, old man. Just another guy who doesn't know when to keep his mouth shut. One of the other boys stepped forward, encouraged by his friend's boldness. Yeah, maybe you should just go somewhere else, he added, his voice filled with mockery. No one wants you here. Leo straightened, his gaze unwavering as he looked at each of them in turn. The park is for everyone, he replied, his voice calm but firm. That includes me. You may not like it, but that doesn't give you the right to chase people away. The boy let out an exaggerated sigh, shaking his head as if he were disappointed. This guy really doesn't get it, does he? I'm trying to help you out. Old man, you don't belong here. Leo took a steadying breath, willing himself to remain calm. The only person here who doesn't belong is the one who can't respect others, he said, his gaze piercing. If you don't like what I have to say, you're welcome to leave. The boy's face twisted with anger, his smirk vanishing as he took another step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. You think you're so smart, don't you? He hissed, his voice low and dangerous. Sitting here, acting like you're better than everyone else. Well, let me tell you something, you're not. Leo's eyes softened slightly as he looked at the boy, recognizing the pain and anger hidden beneath his bravado. I'm not better than anyone, he said quietly. I've just been around long enough to know that anger doesn't make you strong. It only makes you weak. The boy's jaw tightened, his fists shaking as he glared at Leo, his friends watching in silence, their smirks fading as the tension in the air grew thicker. For a brief moment, Leo thought he saw a flicker of uncertainty in the boy's eyes, a hint of doubt that made his anger falter. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a hardened glare. You don't know anything about me, the boy spat, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. Don't act like you do. Leo held his gaze, his expression calm but unyielding. You're right. I don't know you, but I know anger when I see it. I know what it can do to a person if they let it control them. The boy's fists clenched even tighter, his knuckles white. I don't need your advice. I don't need anything from you. With a quick, defiant motion, the boy raised his hand as if to throw another stone, his expression filled with rage. But before he could release it, a voice rang out across the park. Hey, what's going on here? A figure approached from the path. The tall, uniformed park ranger with a badge gleaming on his chest and an authoritative expression on his face. He strode toward the group, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene, his gaze settling on the boy holding the stone. Is there a problem here? The ranger asked, his voice firm. The boy quickly dropped the stone, his expression shifting from anger to surprise. He glanced nervously at his friends, who exchanged uneasy looks, clearly taken aback by the ranger's sudden appearance. They hadn't expected to be interrupted, hadn't anticipated that someone would step in. No problem, the boy muttered, looking down at the ground, his bravado crumbling. The ranger looked at each of them in turn, his gaze unyielding. This park is a place for everyone to enjoy, he said sternly. If you're here to cause trouble, you'd best be on your way. The boys shuffled uncomfortably, their confidence evaporating under the ranger's watchful eye. With one last glance at Leo, the lead boy muttered something under his breath, then turned to leave, his friends following closely behind. They disappeared down the path, their footsteps fading into the distance, leaving the park quiet once more. The ranger turned to Leo, his expression softening. Are you all right, sir? Leo nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I'm fine. Thank you. The ranger returned his smile, nodding respectfully. Glad to hear it. Don't let them get to you. They're just kids, testing boundaries. Leo watched the ranger walk away, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. He knew the ranger was right, they were just kids, testing limits, trying to understand their place in the world. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were headed down a dangerous path, one that would only lead them further from compassion and respect. As he sat back down on the bench, Leo felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had faced the storm and come through it with his dignity intact. The boys might return. They might not. But Leo knew that, whatever happened, he would continue to stand firm, guided by the quiet strength that had carried him through so many trials before. He looked out at the park, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, and felt a deep sense of gratitude for this place. This sanctuary that had given him so much comfort over the years. The park would always be here, a testament to resilience, a reminder that even in the face of hostility, peace was still possible. And as he sat there, letting the calm of the park wash over him, he found himself hoping that one day, those boys might find that peace too. The following week, Leo returned to the park, seeking the familiar comfort of his daily retreat. The confrontation with the boys had left an uneasy mark on him, lingering like a shadow he couldn't quite shake. He told himself he'd done everything right, had stayed calm in the face of hostility, but he felt that familiar ache, an echo of a time he thought he'd left behind. Settling into his usual bench, Leo breathed in the crisp morning air. He traced the grooves in his cane, grounding himself, letting the simple rhythm soothe his restless thoughts. Sunlight broke through the trees, casting gentle beams across the path. He found comfort in the small details, the faint rustling of leaves, the far-off laughter of children, the steady hum of life carrying on around him. Today, however, something was different. He wasn't alone for long before he saw a familiar figure approaching. A boy, shoulders slumped, gaze cast downward. It was the same teenager who had led the taunts last week. But the arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a look of uncertainty and perhaps a trace of something else. Shame. Leo's gaze softened. He could sense the boy's discomfort, the hesitation in his step as he approached the bench. It was as though he were fighting an internal battle, struggling to reconcile the brashness of his past with the humility of the present. The boy stopped a few feet away, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. He looked up at Leo, his expression hesitant, as though he were unsure if he should even be here. "Hey," the boy muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Leo nodded, his expression calm and welcoming. "Hello." For a moment, silence hung between them, thick and awkward. The boy shifted from foot to foot, his gaze darting to the ground, to the trees, anywhere but at Leo. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough but sincere. "I wanted to, apologize for last time," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "For what I said and did." Leo watched him carefully, noting the nervousness in his posture, the way he fidgeted with his hands. He could see that the boy's apology wasn't rehearsed, wasn't a mere formality. It was genuine, a tentative step toward something different, something better. "I appreciate that," Leo replied, his tone gentle. "Takes courage to come back here and say that." The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his face remained guarded. "Yeah, well, I was out of line. It wasn't right. What I did." Leo nodded, acknowledging his words without judgment. We all make mistakes, son. What matters is what we learn from them. The boy's eyes flicked up, meeting Leo's gaze for the first time. There was a glimmer of vulnerability there, a flicker of uncertainty that Leo recognized all too well. It was the look of someone who had been hurt, who had been forced to put on a tough exterior as a shield against the world. "Can I sit?" the boy asked, his voice barely audible. Leo nodded, gesturing to the spot beside him. The boy hesitated for a moment, then sat down, his hands still shoved deep in his pockets. They sat in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts, the gap between them bridged by something unspoken but understood. After a while, Leo broke the silence. "You know, when I was your age, I had a lot of anger in me too. I thought being tough meant not letting anyone see what I was really feeling." The boy glanced at him, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "Yeah? What happened?" Leo smiled faintly, his gaze distant as he recalled those turbulent years. "I learned the hard way that hiding behind anger doesn't make you strong. It just makes you lonely, keeps you from the people who actually want to help." The boy's face softened, and for the first time, Leo saw a flicker of understanding. He could tell the boy was listening, really listening, not just to his words but to the story behind them. "My dad," the boy started, his voice cracking slightly. He paused, swallowing hard. "My dad's always telling me how people like you are. You know, different, not worth our time. He says it's because you don't belong." Leo's heart ached at the boy's confession. He could hear the pain in the boy's voice, the weight of the words he'd been taught to believe. Leo knew all too well the power of words, how they could shape a person's world, build walls that kept out compassion, understanding, and respect. "That's a heavy burden to carry," Leo said softly. "Sometimes, the things people teach us aren't about us at all. They're about what they're afraid of." The boy looked at him, confusion etched on his face. "What do you mean?" Leo took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "People who spread hate do it because they're afraid. Maybe they don't understand something, or maybe they feel threatened. But instead of facing that fear, they try to control it by making others feel small." The boy's eyes widened slightly, his expression thoughtful. He seemed to be grappling with something, a concept that had always been foreign to him but was beginning to take root. "So, you're saying my dad's wrong?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Leo didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out at the park, the gentle sway of the trees, the birds flitting through the branches. "I'm saying that sometimes people hold onto things that don't serve them, things that only make them feel worse. And sometimes, they pass those things down, thinking they're doing the right thing, when really they're just passing on their pain." The boy's face grew somber, and he nodded slowly, as though he were beginning to understand. They sat in silence for a few more moments, each of them lost in thought. Finally, the boy looked at Leo, his expression sincere. "I don't want to be like that," he said, his voice steady but soft. "I don't want to keep carrying all that hate." Leo smiled, a warm, gentle smile that held a lifetime of understanding. "That's a good start, son. Recognizing it is the first step. Letting it go, that's the hard part. But it's worth it." The boy nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I don't know how to do that." Leo reached over, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "One day at a time, and you don't have to do it alone. There are people who want to help, friends, teachers, people who see who you really are." The boy's eyes met his, and for the first time, Leo saw hope there, a spark of something new and unfamiliar but welcome. It was the beginning of change. a small but significant shift toward a different future. "Thank you," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. Leo nodded, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Anytime." As the boy stood to leave, he hesitated, glancing back at Leo with a thoughtful expression. "Maybe I'll see you around." Then, Leo smiled, his eyes warm. "I'll be here." The boy gave a small nod, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. And then he turned and walked away, his steps lighter than before. Leo watched him go, a deep sense of peace settling over him. He knew that the road ahead for the boy would be long and difficult, filled with moments of doubt and struggle. But he also knew that he had planted a seed, a small but powerful reminder that there was another way. And as he sat there, letting the stillness of the park wash over him, Leo felt a quiet pride, not for himself, but for the boy who had found the courage to break free from the chains of anger and hate. He had taken the first step, and in doing so, he had opened the door to a future filled with compassion, understanding, and hope. Leo looked out at the park, the sun casting warm, golden light across the landscape. For the first time in a long time, he felt that the world, with all its flaws and struggles, was just a little bit brighter. The morning sun rose quietly, casting long shadows across the familiar paths of the park. But Leo felt an unusual tension in the air as he made his way to his usual bench. He had barely settled in, breathing in the calm, when he noticed a figure striding purposefully toward him. As she drew closer, he recognized her instantly, the boy's mother, Karen, her face flushed with anger, her pace brisk, almost aggressive. Karen's appearance was sharp, calculated, a tailored suit, pristine handbag, and an expression that Leo had seen countless times before. It was the look of someone who expected the world to bend to her will, who assumed authority wherever she went. Her eyes narrowed as she approached, lips pressed tightly together, her entire demeanor radiating an unspoken accusation. "Are you Leo Johnson?" Her voice was clipped, cool, with an edge that cut through the park's early morning stillness. Leo nodded slowly, remaining seated, his hands resting peacefully on his cane. "Yes, I am. Can I help you, ma'am?" Karen folded her arms across her chest, tilting her head as she looked down at him with a disapproving glare. "I'm Jason's mother, the boy you decided to turn into a criminal." Leo kept his gaze steady, noting the anger in her voice, the thinly veiled hostility. He had a feeling this encounter had little to do with the truth and more to do with Karen's need to defend her perception of her son and herself. "Your son made his own choices, ma'am," Leo replied evenly, his tone respectful but firm. "He approached me, and he chose to act the way he did." Karen scoffed, an almost incredulous sound that escaped her lips before she could restrain it. "You expect me to believe that? My son would never act out unless provoked. He's a good boy, respectful. You must have done something to set him off." The accusation hung heavy in the air, and Leo took a steadying breath, feeling the familiar weight of prejudice and denial that had followed him his entire life. He could tell Karen wasn't here to seek understanding. She was here to defend her son's behavior, no matter the cost. "I understand you want to protect your son," Leo said, his voice calm and unwavering. "But what he did was his choice. I didn't provoke him, nor did I encourage him to behave that way. I simply sat here, and he came to me." Karen's expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't believe that. Jason is not like that. He's never caused trouble before, and now, because of you, he has to do community service. He's humiliated, Do you have any idea what this could do to his future? Leo looked at her with a steady gaze, sensing the underlying fear behind her anger. It wasn't just anger for her son. It was anger born of a fear that the comfortable image she had built for herself and her family was beginning to crack. Sometimes, facing consequences is the only way for people to learn. Leo replied quietly, "It doesn't mean his future is ruined. It means he has an opportunity to reflect and change." Karen's face twisted in disbelief, her voice rising. "You think you know my son? You don't know anything about him. Or me, for that matter. You don't know the pressure he's under, the things he deals with." Leo felt the familiar ache of understanding as he looked at her, recognizing the complexity of her defensiveness, her fear. He knew it wasn't easy to confront the flaws in those we loved, especially our children. But he also knew that excusing behavior out of misplaced loyalty did more harm than good. "You're right. I don't know everything about him," Leo admitted. "But I do know that we all have choices, and we're responsible for them. Ignoring that only keeps him from growing." Karen's expression faltered, the briefest flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. She quickly masked it, shaking her head in anger. "This isn't about choices. It's about people like you," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of frustration and resentment. "People like you who think you can get away with anything, who think you can manipulate things to make someone like my son look bad." Leo felt a pang of sadness at her words, the depth of misunderstanding and prejudice that lay beneath them. He knew, in that moment, that Karen wasn't just defending her son. She was defending her own fears, her own insecurities, her own need to believe that she and her family were above reproach. "Ma'am," Leo said gently, "I didn't make your son look bad. He acted on his own, and he's facing the consequences of those actions. If you truly want what's best for him, you might consider helping him learn from this instead of trying to shield him." Karen's face flushed with anger, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "How dare you tell me how to raise my son? You don't know anything about me or my family." Leo met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a quiet but firm strength. "I may not know you, ma'am, but I do know that every young person deserves the chance to grow, to learn. Protecting him from his own actions won't help him. It will only make things harder in the long run." For a moment, Karen's facade cracked, her eyes reflecting a mix of anger and something else, something vulnerable, perhaps even fearful. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by a look of hardened resolve. "You're just trying to make yourself look like some kind of saint," she spat. "But I see right through you. People like you don't really care about kids like Jason. You just want to make yourselves feel better." The words stung, though Leo kept his expression neutral. He'd heard similar accusations before, veiled attempts to diminish his intentions, to invalidate his experiences. But he refused to let her words shake his resolve. "I don't expect you to understand," he replied, his voice steady. "But I do care. I care because I know what it's like to face judgment, to carry burdens that others put on you. I don't want that for Jason. He deserves a chance to learn from this, to find a different path." Karen glared at him, her face flushed with anger, but there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. For a moment, it seemed as though she might soften, that she might begin to see the truth in his words. But instead, she took a step back, her expression hardening once more. "Well, I don't care what you think," she said coldly. "My son isn't going to be your project. We don't need you, or your opinions." With that, she turned on her heel, her footsteps sharp and purposeful as she walked away, leaving Leo alone on the bench. the air thick with the residue of anger and misunderstanding. Leo watched her go, feeling a pang of sadness, not for himself, but for Jason. He could see, all too clearly, the cycle of denial and defensiveness that had shaped the boy's worldview. The same cycle that Karen herself was trapped in. It wasn't easy to break free from that, to see the world through a different lens. But he hoped deeply, fervently, that Jason would find his way. As Karen's figure disappeared down the path, Leo took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of the world settle on his shoulders. He knew there were no guarantees, no promises of change, but he also knew that change was possible, that people could grow and learn, even when it seemed impossible. Settling back on the bench, Leo looked out at the park, the morning sunlight filtering through the trees. He let the stillness of the moment soothe him, grounding himself in the quiet strength he had cultivated over a lifetime. No matter how much resistance he faced, he would continue to believe in the possibility of growth, of understanding, of reconciliation. In the end, he realized, it wasn't about changing everyone he encountered, it was about planting seeds, about showing the way, even if others weren't ready to follow. And as he sat there, alone but at peace, Leo felt a quiet resolve settle within him. He would continue to sit on this bench, to offer his kindness, his wisdom, his strength, because he knew that sometimes, even the smallest acts of patience and understanding could ripple out into the world, touching lives in ways he might never fully see. For now, he would wait, knowing that he had done all he could, and sometimes, that was enough. A week had passed since Karen's heated confrontation with Leo, but the lingering effects of that day remained, casting a shadow over Jason's thoughts. He found himself replaying the scene in his mind, seeing his mother's anger, the way she had fiercely defended him without ever once considering that he might have actually been in the wrong. Yet something about her reaction felt unsettling to him now. The certainty he once felt that he was blameless, that his actions were somehow justified, began to dissolve in the quiet spaces of his thoughts. Jason's first community service session was scheduled for that Saturday. He woke up with a mixture of resentment and dread, his stomach twisted in knots. As he dressed in an old shirt and jeans, he tried to shake off the irritation he felt, but it clung to him like a second skin. His mother had insisted that he wasn't at fault, yet here he was, about to spend hours picking up trash in a city park. Arriving at the designated location, Jason spotted the other volunteers already gathered, some chatting, others waiting quietly. A supervisor handed him a pair of gloves and a trash bag without much of a greeting. Jason shuffled over to join the group, feeling both out of place and annoyed. He avoided eye contact, his head down as he listened to the supervisor's instructions. "Remember, you're here to make a difference in the community," the supervisor said, his tone practical but warm. "Treat this experience as a chance to contribute, not just a punishment." Jason rolled his eyes slightly but kept his thoughts to himself, barely paying attention as the group split off to different areas of the park. His task was simple: collect litter,
Sort recyclable.
and dispose of everything responsibly. He started his work grudgingly, dragging his feet as he moved along the paths. As the hours ticked by, Jason's mind wandered, growing restless with each passing moment. He couldn't shake the memory of his encounter with Leo, the calm in the old man's eyes, the way he'd stood his ground without ever raising his voice or showing anger. It struck him as strange, even uncomfortable, that Leo had neither shouted nor retaliated. No matter what Jason had said or done, Leo had simply sat there, unmovable, his silence speaking louder than words. Why hadn't Leo fought back? Why had he taken it all with such composure? Jason paused, a crumpled soda can in his hand, as a wave of frustration surged within him. But this frustration wasn't aimed at Leo or even the situation. It was directed inward, at himself, somewhere deep down. He was beginning to realize that his actions hadn't been out of strength, but out of weakness. He had bullied someone who hadn't fought back, someone who had chosen patience over conflict, and now, in the stillness of the park, Jason felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He bent down, picking up a plastic bag caught in a bush, his movements slower, more reflective. Around him, other volunteers worked silently, each person focused on their tasks. For the first time, Jason began to notice the sense of purpose in the people around him, the quiet determination they carried as they cleaned the park. No one was here out of obligation or resentment. They were here to make a difference, however small. A voice broke his concentration. "Hey, need a hand with that?" Jason looked up, surprised to see an older man holding a trash bag, offering him a small smile. He was one of the regular volunteers, and he'd been working steadily since they'd arrived. Yeah, thanks," Jason muttered, handing over the tangled plastic bag. The man deftly untangled it, placing it in his bag before glancing at Jason. "You're one of the new ones." "Huh?" he asked casually. "Don't see many young people around here." "Glad to have you." Jason shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "I'm only here because I have to be. Got in trouble for something." The man nodded, not pressing further. "Well, doesn't matter why you're here. What matters is what you take from it." He gave Jason a thoughtful look. "Sometimes, these small tasks give us more than we realize." Jason didn't respond, but he felt the man's words linger in his mind as he returned to his work. He found himself moving with more intention, his thoughts heavy with the realization that he had the chance to do something worthwhile, even if it was just picking up litter. By the end of his shift, Jason was exhausted, but there was a strange sense of relief that he hadn't felt in days. As he handed in his trash bag, he caught himself glancing at the other volunteers, noticing the camaraderie, the shared smiles, and the subtle nods of encouragement. He realized that they saw him as one of them, no questions asked. For the first time, he felt a flicker of belonging, a sense of quiet acceptance that didn't demand anything from him. Walking back home, Jason's thoughts drifted to Leo. He remembered the old man's words, the quiet way he had spoken, the strength in his gaze. There was a clarity in Leo that Jason hadn't seen in anyone before, calm that was both humbling and inspiring. He had been so blinded by his own anger, his own insecurities, that he hadn't seen the strength it took for Leo to sit there and take it all without retaliation. As Jason rounded the corner to his house, he saw his mother waiting on the porch, her arms crossed, her face tight with frustration. "Well?" she demanded as he approached. "How was it? As miserable as they meant it to be?" Jason hesitated, sensing the expectation in her voice. She wanted him to complain, to confirm her belief that this whole situation was unjust, that he was a victim, but something held him back. A quiet voice in his mind urging him to choose his words carefully. "It was fine," he said simply, not meeting her eyes. "Just picked up trash, sorted it." Karen's expression softened, relief washing over her features as she assumed he was agreeing with her. "Good. They shouldn't have forced you into this in the first place. You didn't do anything wrong." Jason felt a pang of discomfort, the words sticking in his throat. For the first time, he felt the weight of what he had done, and it didn't sit right to brush it off as nothing. "I did do something wrong," he admitted quietly, his voice barely a whisper. I messed up, and I deserved to face the consequences. Karen's face fell, shock and confusion crossing her features. What are you talking about? Jason, you were defending yourself. That man. Mom, stop. Jason interrupted, his voice firmer than he expected. He didn't do anything wrong. He just sat there. I was the one who started everything. Karen blinked, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for something to say. But you didn't mean it. You didn't know what you were doing. Jason shook his head. I knew what I was doing. I just didn't care. And that's on me, not him. The admission hung heavy between them, and Karen's face twisted in disbelief, hurt flashing in her eyes. She reached out to him, her voice trembling. Jason, you don't have to say that. I know you, and I know you wouldn't hurt anyone intentionally. Jason stepped back, holding up his hands. Maybe you don't know me as well as you think, Mom, because I did hurt him, and I need to make things right. Karen's eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking. You're my son. You're a good person. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. But Jason could no longer take comfort in her words. He saw now that they were just a shield she used to protect herself, to avoid facing the truth. And while he still loved her, he knew he couldn't continue hiding behind her denial. Without another word, he turned and walked into the house, leaving his mother standing alone on the porch, her figure slumped with confusion and grief. Inside, he took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he made a decision to face the reality he had tried to avoid. That evening, after hours of wrestling with his thoughts, Jason picked up his phone and dialed a number he had found on a community contact list. It rang several times before he heard the familiar, calm voice on the other end. Hello, this is Leo Johnson. Jason swallowed, his voice trembling as he spoke. Mr. Johnson, it's Jason. I wanted to talk to you. There was a pause on the other end, and Jason felt his heart race, unsure of what to expect. But then Leo's voice came through, gentle and open. All right, Jason, I'm listening. As Jason began to speak, he felt a weight lift from his chest, each word a step closer to healing, to understanding, to change. In that moment, he knew that this was only the beginning, that he had a long road ahead. But for the first time, he felt ready to face it, and he knew that, with Leo's guidance, he could begin to rebuild, one choice at a time. Jason sat across from Leo in the quiet corner of the local community center, where they had agreed to meet that Saturday morning. The sun streamed through the tall windows, casting warm light over the simple room. Jason's heart pounded as he took in the familiar lines of Leo's face, the wisdom in his eyes, the calm strength in his posture. The memory of that day in the park still lingered, raw and humbling, as Jason looked at the man he had once treated with such contempt. Leo's expression was gentle, understanding, but Jason could sense the silent strength beneath it. For the first time, he was seeing Leo not as the old man he had once ridiculed, but as someone who carried a lifetime of resilience, someone who had likely faced challenges Jason couldn't even imagine. Sitting here now, Jason felt the shame rise in his throat, threatening to overwhelm him. Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Johnson, Jason began, his voice unsteady but earnest. I know I don't deserve it after everything. Leo gave a small nod, a faint smile softening the lines on his face. Jason, I believe in second chances. We've all made mistakes. What matters is what we choose to do after those mistakes. Jason's shoulders relaxed, encouraged by Leo's words. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. I wanted to apologize to you in person, not just because of my community service or because it's expected. I needed to do this for myself, too. I was wrong, terribly wrong. I said things and did things that I'm ashamed of. You didn't deserve any of it. Leo listened in silence, allowing Jason the space to say what he needed to say. When Jason finished, Leo's gaze softened even more, and he leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Jason, recognizing the harm you've done is an important step, he said. But the real work comes afterward. Change is not just about apologies. It's about understanding why you did what you did and deciding to be a better person every day. The words hit Jason with the weight of their truth. He nodded, feeling both humbled and relieved by Leo's straightforward guidance. I want to understand, Mr. Johnson. I want to be better, but I don't really know where to start. Leo's eyes held a spark of warmth, and he leaned back, considering Jason's words. It starts with learning to listen. Most of us don't take the time to really hear others. If you want to grow, Jason, you need to be willing to listen, especially to those whose experiences are different from yours. Jason absorbed Leo's words carefully, realizing that this was something he'd never done before. He had always been quick to assume he knew best, dismissing others, especially those he had been taught to look down on. But now, sitting across from Leo, he felt the gravity of his ignorance and the weight of his own prejudices. Leo continued, his voice steady. You know, people like me, we've had to grow up with resilience. We didn't always have a choice. Our lives were filled with expectations that we had to defy every day just to keep moving forward. Some people look at that as weakness, but I see it as strength. Jason found himself nodding, listening intently as Leo spoke. For the first time, he was hearing a perspective he had never been willing to understand. A life lived under a different set of rules. He wanted to know more, to understand more deeply, but he wasn't sure how to ask. I don't know how you stayed so calm that day, Jason finally admitted, his voice hesitant. I don't think I could have done that. Leo smiled softly. Calm isn't something you're born with, Jason. It's something you learn, especially when the world doesn't always treat you with respect. You learn to carry yourself with dignity, no matter what anyone says or does. It's how you hold on to your sense of self. Jason's throat tightened, feeling a pang of guilt for how he had tried to strip that dignity from Leo. I didn't understand any of that. I was just angry. It felt like you were trying to show me up by staying calm. Like you were better than me. Leo shook his head slowly. Jason, it was never about that. It was about standing firm in who I am, and refusing to let anyone take that from me. He paused, letting his words sink in before he continued. When we react with anger, we give up control, but when we respond with calm, we keep our power. Jason thought about this, realizing that in all his actions, he had been trying to control Leo, to get a reaction, and when he hadn't, it had only fueled his anger further. Now, he could see that it wasn't Leo's calm that had been the issue. It was his own need to dominate, to feel powerful at someone else's expense. Mr. Johnson, Jason began, struggling to find the right words. I'm starting to see things differently. I don't want to be the person I was in that park. I don't want to keep making those same mistakes. Leo smiled, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. That's a good place to start. Jason, real growth takes time. You won't become a different person overnight, but with each choice you make, you can choose the person you want to be. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the air between them carrying a sense of understanding. Jason could feel the weight of the past lifting. replaced by a hope he hadn't felt before. Do you think you could help me? Jason asked hesitantly, unsure if his request would be accepted. Leo nodded, his expression kind but serious. I can share what I know. Jason, I can guide you, help you understand a different way of living. But the work is yours to do. If you're willing to put in the effort, I'll be here. Jason felt a swell of gratitude, a deep relief that he hadn't expected. Thank you. I don't deserve it, but I'll do whatever it takes to change. Leo's gaze was firm, yet filled with compassion. Change isn't about deserving it. It's about wanting it and putting in the effort. Every day, you have to make that choice. Over the next few weeks, Jason met with Leo regularly. They shared long conversations, not only about the incident in the park but about life, perspectives, and resilience. Leo introduced Jason to stories of other people who had faced challenges and risen above them. He encouraged Jason to volunteer more, to observe the world around him, and to learn from those whose paths were different from his own. One afternoon, as they walked together after another session, Jason looked at Leo and said, I've started seeing things differently. It's like I'm waking up to things I never noticed before. Leo nodded approvingly. That's growth, Jason. It's not always comfortable, but it's the start of something important. Jason took a deep breath, realizing just how much he still had to learn, but also recognizing that he was ready to take on that journey. No matter how difficult it might be, his life wasn't going to change in an instant, and he still had mistakes to own up to. But with each step, he felt a growing strength within himself, a strength that didn't need to dominate or control, but instead sought to understand and respect. As they parted ways that evening, Leo placed a reassuring hand on Jason's shoulder. You're doing well, Jason. Remember, it's not about where you started, but where you're going. Jason nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. For the first time, he felt that he was heading somewhere meaningful, that he had a purpose beyond himself. And as he walked away, he realized that he wasn't just seeking redemption for what he had done to Leo. He was finding a path to becoming someone he could be proud of, someone who could, in time, make a difference. Jason had been making steady progress in his journey towards self-awareness and respect for others. With Leo's guidance, he'd learned valuable lessons about humility, patience, and understanding. He had even begun his community service hours at a local youth center, where he worked with kids from different backgrounds, helping them with homework and organizing activities. He was discovering not just the value of giving back, but also how much he could learn from the kids he was meant to help. But even as he made strides forward, Jason knew that growth wouldn't be a straight path. The real test of his progress would come not from his work at the youth center or his conversations with Leo, but from how he faced the people from his past, those who had once shared his old views. One afternoon, Jason was headed home from his shift at the youth center when he ran into Max, one of his old friends from high school, who he hadn't seen since everything had changed. Max spotted Jason from across the street, his face lighting up in recognition as he crossed over to greet him. Jason, man, it's been forever. Max slapped Jason on the back, his usual easygoing smile in place. Where you been, Heedy? Jason managed a small smile but felt a wave of discomfort rise within him. Max was a reminder of who he used to be, of the person he was trying so hard to leave behind. I've been, you know. Woo! Max chuckled, clearly not catching on to Jason's hesitance. Ah, the old man from the park, right? Man, that was wild. You should have seen the looks people were giving him when you were telling him off. Thought he might have had a heart attack right there. Jason's stomach tightened, his mind flashing back to that day. He had seen it from a different lens now, a cruel act that had done nothing but display his own ignorance. But to Max it was still a joke, an incident he seemed proud of. Max, that wasn't cool. I mean, it really wasn't, Jason said, his voice steady but firm. What I did to Mr. Johnson, it was wrong. I know that now. Max's face faltered, clearly taken aback by Jason's words. He let out a scoffing laugh, brushing it off. Come on, Jason, don't tell me you're buying into that woke stuff now. We were just messing around. Who cares what that old guy thought? Jason took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Here was a person who had once validated his worst behavior, someone who embodied the attitudes he was working so hard to leave behind. But he knew this was his test, his chance to stand firm in his new path. It matters, Max, he said, his voice quiet but unwavering. What I did mattered, and it was wrong. Mr. Johnson didn't deserve that, and I'm working to make things right. People aren't just others we mess with. They're people, just like you and me. Max stared at him in disbelief, as though he were looking at a stranger. Jason could see the confusion, the shock on his face, and he felt a twinge of nervousness. Standing up to an old friend wasn't easy, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. Since when did you get so soft? Max said, folding his arms, his tone laced with sarcasm. You used to be fun, man. Not like this. Jason felt a flash of anger at the comment, but he reminded himself of Leo's advice. Stay calm, hold your ground, and remember who you're trying to be. He straightened his posture, meeting Max's gaze directly. I'm not soft, Max. I just know better now, Jason replied. If that means not acting like a jerk to prove something, then I'll take that over being fun. Max shook his head, a look of disappointment crossing his face. Guess we're different now. You're turning into one of those guys, soft, sensitive. Don't blame me when you realize the world doesn't care about that stuff. With a shrug, Max turned and walked away, leaving Jason standing there in the middle of the street, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. He knew that his friendship with Max might never be the same, but as he watched Max walk off, he felt the weight of an old chapter closing. Jason continued his walk home, the city alive around him, the sounds of the street, the hum of cars, the voices of people passing by, the distant laughter from a nearby cafe, all seemed to blend into a comforting background. He had let go of something old, something he no longer needed, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of his own choices, his own path. A week later, Jason sat with Leo at their usual spot in the park. The early evening light cast long shadows, and the soft murmur of conversation filled the air. Jason shared what had happened with Max, the uncomfortable exchange, and the bittersweet feeling of letting go. Leo listened, nodding thoughtfully. When Jason finished, he looked at him with quiet pride. You passed an important test, Jason, Leo said. It's not easy to stand firm when the people around you try to pull you back into your old ways. But you did it. You chose a different path. Jason felt a rush of gratitude for Leo's words, but he knew that his journey wasn't complete. He had made progress, but there would be more challenges, more moments when he would have to stand firm in his new beliefs. Do you think it'll always be like this? He asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Will I always have to defend myself to people who don't understand? Leo smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. You'll face those moments. Yes, people will challenge you, and some won't understand. But each time you choose to stay true to yourself, you get stronger, and eventually, you'll find people who do understand, people who value you for who you are now. not who you used to be. The words settled in Jason's mind, comforting and empowering all at once. He realized that growth wasn't about becoming perfect or never making mistakes. It was about choosing the right path, over and over again, even when it was difficult. As they sat in the park, Leo reached out and placed a reassuring hand on Jason's shoulder. You're on a good path, Jason. Keep walking it. And remember, you're not alone. You've got support now, even when it gets tough. There are people who believe in you, who want to see you succeed. Jason felt a swell of warmth in his chest, a renewed sense of purpose. He had found something more meaningful than the validation of people like Max. He had found a mentor in Leo, someone who had shown him the power of resilience, understanding, and quiet strength. They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the park. Jason knew that this was just the beginning, that he would continue to face trials and tests. But with each challenge, he felt more certain of who he was becoming. The man he was now was a far cry from the boy who had tried to prove his strength by tearing others down. He was someone who understood the value of respect, who valued others for their humanity rather than their differences. And in Leo's presence, he found the courage to keep moving forward, one day at a time. As they finally rose to leave, Jason looked at Leo, a small smile playing on his lips. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for everything. Leo returned the smile, his eyes filled with quiet pride. You're welcome, Jason. Keep moving forward. You've got a good heart. Trust it. And as they walked out of the park together, Jason felt a deep sense of peace, a feeling of wholeness he had never known before. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them. He was ready to live up to the man he knew he could become. Several months had passed since Jason had taken his first steps toward change. The impact of his journey was beginning to unfold not only in his own life but in the lives of those around him. People he once dismissed were now becoming friends and allies, and those who could not understand his new path gradually faded into the background. But the real challenge had been his relationship with his mother, Karen. She still struggled with her pride and her need to control the narrative. Convinced that Jason's actions, and the consequences he faced, were unfairly forced upon him. Yet, Jason held firm, no longer willing to bend to her views or live in the shadow of her expectations. One morning, Karen stopped by his place, her expression guarded. She had recently faced her own legal battles, and though she had avoided jail time, she was now dealing with mandatory community service. It had been a hard road for her, and for Jason, seeing his mother at her most vulnerable stirred a complex blend of sympathy and frustration. Jason, she started, her voice tight, almost reluctant. I came here to talk. I know things have been tense. Maybe I haven't been open to seeing things the way you do. Jason looked at her carefully, trying to gauge her sincerity. She seemed different somehow, though he couldn't tell if it was true remorse or just the weight of her own experience finally taking its toll. You've always told me that people should be responsible for themselves, Mom. Jason replied softly. Maybe this is one of those times where you need to take responsibility too. I know I did, and it helped me grow.
Hindsight.
A flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. I don't know, Jason. It's not easy. I feel like everything has changed. Like people see me differently now. It's hard to accept. Jason took a deep breath, feeling the moment's importance. This was an opportunity for him to offer her the support she'd always denied him. A chance to show her how understanding and empathy could heal instead of divide. I know it's hard, Mom, but I also know it's worth it. You have a chance to make things right, just like I did. You don't have to go through it alone. But it has to start with you. She looked at him, a glimmer of vulnerability in her eyes. It was the first time he'd seen her truly open to the possibility of change. Maybe I don't know how to do that, Jason. Maybe you could help me. Jason nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her request. He'd never imagined he would be in this position. Yet here he was, ready to guide her if she was willing to follow. We can take it one step at a time, he said gently. It's not about doing it perfectly. It's about making a choice, each day, to be better. The words settled between them, and for the first time, Karen seemed to accept them. She reached out and placed her hand over his, a gesture of tentative reconciliation. It was the start of a new chapter for them both, one built on honesty rather than control. As the weeks passed, Jason continued his journey, now working closely with Leo at the youth center, helping other kids struggling with anger, prejudice, and the weight of expectations. Leo had become a guiding figure not only in Jason's life, but in the lives of many young people who found solace in his quiet wisdom and steady presence. One evening, as the last of the kids left the center, Leo sat down with Jason, a soft smile playing on his face. I'm proud of you, Jason. You've taken every challenge, every setback, and turned it into something meaningful. That's no small feat. Jason looked down, a little embarrassed by the praise. I still have a long way to go. There are days when I feel like I'm only just starting. Leo nodded thoughtfully. Growth isn't a destination. It's a process. Some days, it's about leaps forward. Other days, it's about holding steady. But as long as you're moving with purpose, you're on the right path. Jason took in Leo's words, feeling a sense of comfort and clarity wash over him. He had come so far, yet he knew his journey was far from over. But instead of dreading the challenges ahead, he felt ready to face them, confident in the person he was becoming. The following weekend, Jason found himself back in the park, sitting on the same bench where he had once harassed Leo. It was quiet and peaceful, with the early morning sun casting a warm glow across the grass. As he looked around, he realized how different everything felt. How different he felt. This place was no longer a battleground of ego and resentment. It had become a place of reflection, a symbol of his transformation. As he sat there, he saw a young boy kicking a soccer ball nearby, struggling to keep it under control. After a few failed attempts, the boy finally lost control of the ball, and it rolled toward Jason's bench. Jason reached down, scooping up the ball and tossing it back to the boy with a grin. Keep at it, he said, encouragingly. You'll get the hang of it. The boy flashed a grateful smile and went back to his practice. Jason watched him for a moment, a gentle pride filling his chest. He had become the kind of person who uplifted others rather than tore them down, a role model rather than a threat. Leo joined him a few minutes later, taking a seat beside him. They sat in silence for a while, watching the park come to life around them. Finally, Leo spoke. Feels good, doesn't it? He asked, a knowing smile in his voice. Jason nodded, his gaze steady. Yeah, it does. I never thought I'd feel like this, like I could actually make a difference. Leo placed a reassuring hand on Jason's shoulder. You're not just making a difference, Jason. You're building a legacy, and that's something worth fighting for. As they sat together, Jason felt a profound sense of peace, a sense that he had finally come full circle. His journey had been painful, humbling, and challenging, but it had also given him a strength and clarity he'd never known before. He was ready for whatever lay ahead, knowing that he had the resilience, the support, and the determination to live up to the man he was meant to become. In that moment, as the sun rose higher and filled the park with light, Jason felt a quiet assurance within himself. He had found a new path, a new purpose, and with Leo by his side, he knew he would continue to grow, to learn, and to lead others toward understanding and compassion. And as he looked out at the world around him, he realized that the future was wide open, filled with the promise of new beginnings and the power of redemption.